Okay, so I had to take 2 months or so off from writing articles and making these videos because I had a big response article I was working on, and my family took a bunch of vacations and a whole bunch of other things happened. But now I'm doing this again, and I'd originally had something else planned. And then Sony announced that they were making a new game in one of my favorite series, God of War. If you look closely, right up there, the camera doesn't show it terribly well, but that is a statue of Kratos and Atreus from God of War 2018 fighting. The one that's... My arm doesn't want to bend that way. The dragon that's fairly close to them is not a dragon from that game, although it looks kind of like one of the ones they fought. I'm a big fan of this series. I have been for probably pushing 15, 16 years now. Yeah, it was one of the HD remixes of God of War. The very first God of War and God of War 2 were some of the first games I played when I originally got a PlayStation 3 a long, long time ago. In fact, I'm such a big fan of this series that one of the only articles I've actually ever got published, which is in this book right here, I argue for the merits of the God of War 2018 game, the first one in the Norse saga, and how it has a lot of very good things to say about the emptiness of vengeance, how to be a better parent. In fact, when I got done playing that game, like 8 years ago now, I told my wife, this game makes me want to be a better father. The game really is that great. So the point of all this is, I'm a fan of this series, and I was hyped for the next one. I hope you get the idea, at least, that I'm a fan of the series. So, Sony announced that the new game is going to be called God of War Laufey, and this is the first time in the series that the games will not, at least seemingly as best as we can tell, will not feature Kratos as the main playable character, but it's going to shift focus to his second wife, Faye, who was a character in God of War 2018 and in Ragnarok, but you don't actually really interact with her very much at all, except in like flashbacks, because she's dead. So her presence very much affects and is a key component of the story, but more through like reputation and you learning about things that she's done rather than her just like being there beside you. Now, naturally, because this is 2016 and the internet exists, everyone immediately started arguing in bad faith about the game, and people are accusing each other of being too woke, snowflakes, misogynistic. You just don't want to play the game because it's a woman there, or the woman isn't attractive enough, etc., etc., etc. It's all ridiculous, you know. Well, what occurred to me as I was thinking about these things, like something about it seemed off to me, but rather than, joining the courses online, I said, well, let me think about this and see, why does something about this seem off to me? And it occurred to me that you can actually make some good faith arguments about this that are philosophically interesting. And if you look at the thumbnail about this, that I put up about this, I deliberately made it wrong in many ways. You've got Harry Potter there holding a rifle, Kratos holding a lightsaber. The woman in the middle is supposed to be Faye, but AI wouldn't let me reproduce her because of copyright things and maybe some other stuff. But she's supposed to be holding a magic wand from Harry Potter, the idea being, that's wrong. Kratos doesn't use a lightsaber, Harry Potter doesn't use a gun. Well, how can we say that's wrong? Can a story or series change so much that it's just no longer the same thing? This is an important and interesting question. I'm also a fan of Star Trek, but not the current modern iterations, as I've found them to be almost universally terrible. I tried, and I gave up on it after like the second season of Discovery because I was like, this is just bad storytelling. Now, is that just my own subjective preference? Is my assertion that the current makers of Star Trek are just incompetent hacks who are completely incapable of telling a good story, is that true? Or did Star Trek change so much that it lost its essence? Or is it a combination of the three? So the point is here, is there a point at which I can say of something, that's just not Star Trek? And if there is, how do I justify that claim? And same thing with God of War or Harry Potter. As an example, I once asked my wife, because we discuss things like this, she's a big Harry Potter fan. We're reading our kids the Harry Potter series now, and they're really into it, which is pretty cool. Well, as a thought experiment, I once asked her, let's suppose another Harry Potter book is published, but in this one the characters fight each other with firearms and lightsabers. Harry Potter's using a gun, that kind of thing. Would that still be a Harry Potter story? And she said no, because that sounds more like fan fiction. And I think she's correct. Well, philosophy has a long history of asking and exploring this type of question. It's just typically not done through stories and other media. Like one guy, when I put up this article, said, this seems a lot like the ship of Theseus. And I'm like, yes, exactly. That's exactly the type of question we're asking here. So if you're going to try to argue and proceed in good faith, it seems to me then the appropriate question to ask is, if the God of War series has an essence, something that makes it God of War, and if it does removing Kratos as the lead character violate that essence, or does other changes they've made violate that essence? If the answer to both of those questions is yes, then whatever the game God of War Laufey is, it's simply not a God of War game. And this is obviously applicable to many, many other stories and series as well. Is there a point of departure where we can not only just say, that's not God of War, but also, that's not Star Trek, that's not Harry Potter, that's not Star Wars, etc., etc., etc. So it seems to me, if you interpret things in a more fair and good faith manner, behind many of the complaints fans have of modern iterations of these series, something like this is going on. Something like this idea is lurking there. Good faith fans, that is, they're arguing that modern Star Trek just doesn't have the essence, spark, or substance, a term that Aristotle used that's like essence, that the original Star Trek series had, and so it's just not Star Trek anymore, even if you slap that name on it. So there is an idea at work here that everything has a property or properties that are essential to it, such that if you change them, that thing is simply no longer itself. These types of properties are thus essential or necessary properties. So to help explain, I've argued several times before at conferences and some other places that I, Phil Kullberg, have the essential property of being the first son of my parents, Joel and Esther Kullberg. And it seems to me the reason is pretty obvious if you just reflect about it a little bit. If you were to somehow change this aspect of me, the change would be so great that I'd just effectively be a different person. I couldn't be Phil Kullberg anymore, even if you called that different person Phil Kullberg. Change me from the first son of my parents to the first daughter of my parents, and my life experience, biology, perspective, and many other things would be so different that it just wouldn't be meaningful to refer to me as Phil Kullberg anymore. I would be a different person. And this also follows if you change who my parents are, make me the fourth born instead of the first, and so on and so forth. So I presented essays at conferences talking about issues like this regarding essences, personal cores, and substances before. It's quite easy to find other more technical terminology that refers to this idea, but the terminology, that's not really what's important here. What matters is the basic idea. Is there a thing or collection of things or properties that make me me? And if you change them, then I'm simply no longer me. Now, if so, it's quite easy to see how you can then apply this idea to stories, series, and franchises. So is there something that makes Harry Potter stories, such that if you change them, then they're just not Harry Potter stories anymore? Now, this idea of a type of essentialism makes a good deal of sense to me. I think it's correct or on the right track. It also seems to me, at least, that this is the common sense view, as I suspect most people just intuitively recognize there's some point of departure wherein that other person is just not me anymore, where the new TV series is just not Star Trek, and so on. The main trouble is determining, well, where is that point of departure? What is the essential property or properties? Because not only is this often not very clear, it's actually quite difficult to narrow it down. What makes a God of War game a God of War game as opposed to, say, some other violent action game? Other violent action games exist. Are there things other than the name Star Trek, concepts like the Federation and Starfleet, that make Star Trek, and how do you determine what those things are? Now, I think this is probably the best and most common objection to essentialism and related ideas. If we cannot say what things are essential, then what good is the theory? It doesn't really get us anywhere. Well, Aristotle and E.S. Stein actually both attempted to get around this problem by way of negative definition. The idea is, you take a property away, and if the thing remains itself, that wasn't an essential property. If changing or removing the property makes that thing in question not itself anymore, then it is an essential property. Stein actually gave an example of this talking about Caesar, where she says, we find not only the categorical structure of the soul as soul must be retained, but also within its individual form we strike an unchangeable kernel, the personal structure. I can think of Caesar in a village instead of in Rome, and I can think of him transferred into the 20th century. Certainly his historically settled individuality would then go through some changes, but just as surely he would remain Caesar. Her point here is, you can change the properties of where Caesar is located and what time he's in, and he's still Caesar, he's still the same person. Therefore, those are not essential properties. His unchangeable kernel or personal structure remains the same. Now, I do argue that I think that Stein's metaphysical test here can point us toward essential properties, and this is what I did above with my example about myself. Change me from the first son of my parents to the first daughter of my parents. That changes me too much, therefore that's an essential property. But it's still the case that for many things we do not and probably cannot know what the exact essential nature of the property is. It's an imperfect test. It doesn't get us all the way there. There's just a vagueness problem wherein the point of departure is unclear. So, according to my wife, and I agree, a Harry Potter book with firearms and lightsabers, that's a bridge too far. But suppose it's another Harry Potter story where, like, the Muggles use firearms, and one of the characters happens to be a fan of the movies and is watching a Star Wars movie. Well, it's kind of unclear. At the same time, it does seem pretty clear to me that even if J.K. Rowling herself wrote another Harry Potter story where Harry Potter went around assassinating people with a .50 caliber Beretta rifle, I'd say that's just not Harry Potter. However, that's a pretty extreme example. Where's the departure point? Again, it's not clear. Now, I think good faith arguments on the other side can focus on this. If you want to be an anti-essentialist, that's a good faith argument you can make. As Bertrand Russell said of Aristotle's theory of substance, substance is a concept impossible to free from difficulties. A substance is supposed to be something distinct from all its properties, but when we take away all the properties, we find there's nothing left. So, Aristotle's version of the theory here, it's a bit different than Stein's in that he argued that substance is what remains when all properties of a thing are removed. He thought this was necessary as a change must act upon something, and if the properties can change, it cannot be one of them. That's the ship of Theseus example coming in there. He's trying to counter that. So as Russell explained, it turns out that when we take the properties away to see what substance is, there's just not anything left. Thus, substance is kind of a nonsense theory, or so the argument goes. And even though Stein's version, this is better, you can still apply similar criticisms there. Now, there are a significant number of serious philosophers who reject essentialism. I'm friends with some of them, and they're like, you're arguing for essentialism? And they kind of like gave me incredulous stares, And usually their reasons for rejecting it are pretty similar to what Russell articulates or the vagueness problem that I described. It's often unclear what is essential and what's not. And in the cases where we can point to something that is essential, we'll get there in an odd way, like through negative definition, and it's still imperfect. So, suppose, unlike me, you're a proponent of the new God of War game, God of War Laufey. Well, one thing you could do to adopt a good faith argument instead of accusing people of being misogynistic is say you have an anti-essentialism view and argue that there's really just nothing essential about God of War games. It's just a title that Sony slapped on games to make money, and if the developers in Sony want to change the lead character and see if that makes money, so be it. There's nothing essentially God of War-ish about anything, so who cares? Now, my counter-argument to that is if there's nothing essential about anything and essential properties don't exist, how on earth can I group together the Harry Potter novels and say those belong? How can I group together the God of War games and say they belong? Or anything at all? As a more practical example, it seems quite clear to me that trees as a collective group of things exist. And this group is composed of all the trees that exist, or even have existed in the past, or exist in, say, literature and things like that. However, the reason I can group all these things together is that they share whatever that essential property is that makes them all trees. To be fair, though, it seems quite clear to me that virtually everyone else and I is going to struggle to give you a complete analytic definition of what that essential property is. But at the same time, if that property is not there, if there's nothing that essentially makes that a tree and that a weed or a blade of grass or an animal, something completely different, then how can I reasonably group those trees together as opposed to the grass or the weeds or those animals, etc., etc.? At best, if that's the case, we have to say it's just a convention of human speech that's illusionary and doesn't really refer to anything real, or maybe it has practical value, but it doesn't really refer to anything real. Now, this has real-world implications, as for example, how can something like science exist unless there's something that links or groups together the scientific disciplines and makes them distinct from pseudoscience? So, even though I do have a hard time articulating where the point of departure is, it seems perfectly reasonable for me to be able to say there's something that makes a God of War game a God of War game, and then I can argue, well, God of War Laufey, the new one, doesn't have it, at least based on what they showed us. So whatever it is, it's not a God of War game. Now, of course, it doesn't follow that it might not be a good game for other reasons, or that people can't enjoy it. There's other games besides God of War that exist, and I've enjoyed many of them too, and now it's just simply one of those other games that happens to have a God of War title on it. So, I think a much stronger argument that you could then turn around and make against me here would be to argue that Kratos being the main character of God of War is just not an essential aspect. Even if you accept essentialism, you can be like, well, why does Kratos have to be the lead character? How is that essentially God of War-ish? You can point to many other examples, such as how the Mario games have had spin-offs where Yoshi or Luigi are the lead characters, and everyone, seemed perfectly fine with that. It seems to follow that Mario being the lead character is just not an essential aspect of those games, so why does it have to be for God of War that Kratos needs to be the main character? So here you just accept my philosophical claims about essentialism and just turn around and claim, well, you're getting it wrong when you claim that Kratos being the main character is essential. And now, then I think then we can have good faith arguments about that. Like, there's other things about it that the God of War Laufey game that strike me as just like, they don't really fit. Like, why is there a gelatinous cube named Frank? That doesn't seem to fit with the same game where you see Kratos literally ripping the heads off of monsters and things like that. That doesn't really mesh to me. That seems like it's a step outside of whatever makes God of War God of War. Now, maybe you disagree, but now we're having a good faith argument instead of calling each other names. The point there is, this could get much more complicated, but now we're digging into other aspects and properties of games, like, is the aesthetic wrong? Are there characters and ideas that don't belong and don't fit there, a la firearms and lightsabers in Harry Potter? And this could easily become a very, very complicated and nuanced set of arguments and counter-arguments that would get very, very long, and much too long for me to run through either in the essay I wrote or in this video, but then we'd be having a good and useful good faith arguments. Much more importantly, I hope you can see that with a little thought, that this is applicable to many, many other things. For example, there's many groups and churches that claim to be Christian nowadays, but teach and claim things that are quite explicitly anti-Christian, and that's not what Christ claims. But if there's nothing that's essentially Christian, then how can I rationally justify claiming, no, that's anti-Christian? If there isn't anything that's essentially Christian and not Christian, then I don't see how I can rationally justify claiming that Mormons are not Christians, but Roman Catholics are. Similarly, it seems quite clear to me that virtually all the political parties and ideologies in America have now completely abandoned anything like essentialism, and they now just do whatever will give them the most immediate power and benefit. There's simply nothing essential about being a Republican or a Democrat now. I'd argue that 40 years ago, you could actually point to things that were out of bounds for both groups. Now, the borders were vague and not clearly defined, but they did exist because if you crossed it, other members of your party would make it clear that you did. Now, not so much. The borders really are just whatever's going to get us power. There's nothing essential about it anymore at all. So, all of this, I say, it's a way to kind of get us thinking about a better way to do media criticism. Ask yourself, is some type of essentialism correct? And if the answer is yes, then probably the problem you have with a new story, game, or movie in your favorite series is that something you think is essential has changed. Now, it seems quite clear to me that Kratos simply is God of War, and without him, it's just not a God of War game. Does it follow that it's a terrible game? No. Does it mean it's bad that people enjoy it? No. But it's not a God of War game. And I could point to some other examples in the, it was like a 20-minute trailer that they showed where I'm like, that just seems out of place to me to God of War. It doesn't seem like a God of War game. But see, now we're having a good faith discussion about, well, does it fit in the series or not? Other people can obviously disagree and don't think that, say, Kratos being the lead character is essential to God of War, or they think a gelatinous cube named Frank fits in it quite well. Again, that seems... I don't see how that fits in the same series that shows Kratos, like, literally ripping the jaws off of creatures and things like that. But we're having a good faith argument now about what makes a God of War game a God of War game, and we should apply this same type of thing to many other areas of our lives as well.